You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about 3D movies with producer, director, editor Jason Pichonsky. Here we go. I'm hitting record now.
Sorry.
Here we go.
Do we want to initially start?
By all means, go for it, Pete.
I was just going to add, how did you discover Earl Owensby? Was that part of your 3D love, finding him through that avenue or elsewhere?
Yeah, it basically, that's where it started. It was when I got into 3D. And then I got into Earl Owensby. Because at the time, Rottweiler was pretty easy to find. And actually, you could find that in 3D.
Rottweiler is a terrifying experience.
It's just too dangerous to continue.
Nonsense, Mr. Fletcher.
For security reasons, we decided to use a civilian transport. No sense advertising.
Isn't this just a little extreme, just to transport a bunch of dogs?
Rottweilers, sir. The breed supposedly dates back to the time of Christ.
That's a curious remark. If I'm to believe Fletcher's report on the destructive capability of these creatures...
You can believe it, sir. Any mistakes in the operation would be critical.
You've got the authority to stop this thing.
That's true, Mr. Fletcher. A secret military project goes out of control when a truck loaded with nightmares releases its deadly cargo. Rottweiler.
Yeah, we will definitely get to that. And
Yeah.
I guess, why don't we just jump right into that?
Let's go into it. Yes. So you're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, where we're going to be talking about soon Jaws with Paws. That's right, Rottweiler 3D. But today we're talking to guest Jason, and Jason, you're going to help me out here. Is it Bohansky?
Pichonsky.
Thank you.
You know what? It's you're not going to pronounce it based on the spelling.
I am not. So thank you.
Nobody ever has.
That's right. What folks may remember you for, outside of a very difficult last name to say, is that you're a film historian, director. You have contributed to 3 Dimensions of Terror over at Rue Morgue. Over on your website, deathsploitation.com, quote, reflections, ruminations on 3D genre films. And makes sense because you do reviews of modern 3D movies like Resident Evil 3D I saw, Final Destination, Fright Night 3D, also cult classics, the 1961 The Mask that I actually saw recently after Mystery Science Theater riffed it. And I feel like I was behind on that one, having just seen it riffed for the first time. We
could talk about The Mask too, because The Mask sort of is a big part of my fandom of 3D.
Yes, and you have a number of installments on your blog, so must have made an impact on you. Someone that made an impact on all of us, Earl Owensby, another 80s 3D, maybe not so classic. That might be a little stretching it. Tales from the Third Dimension, which you also cover on your blog. Yeah. You've done commentaries for a few movies. The Amityville Curse, the 1990 movie released, I guess, by Vinegar Syndrome from their Canadian imprint, Canadian International Pictures. The fifth in the Amityville series. Yeah, I mean, it's a cottage industry. Amityville spin-offs, canon otherwise and ridiculous, certainly. It seems like, Amityville Curse was one of these. In the VHS era, here's this forgotten Canadian production that was a part of it all, and you contributed to the commentary track to that.
It was still sort of an official part of not the canon. After that is when it sort of branched out and just went everywhere.
That's right. Toilets to space, outhouses, all the different places. Absolutely. You did a commentary for the Kino Lorber release for Treasure of the Four Crowns. Pete and I actually discovered that movie very recently. I had a talk with Austin Trunick, who wrote literally the books on canon films. And you also were featured on a commentary for a movie that Pete and I saw literally last night, 1983's Man Who Wasn't There.
Anytime he wants, he can make himself invisible.
Now, the first 3D action comedy is here.
Let's get him before he peels those clothes off.
The Man Who Wasn't There. It has floating balls and obscene calls.
Don't make that sound, Walter. Oh, Walter, please.
Flying phones.
Who's there?
And erogenous zones.
That's my nose.
Rubbish, Cooper. Pure rubbish.
It's got flying fists and communists.
All power to the people!
Quick thinking.
Circle on the block.
And heavy drinking. You'll see surprises.
He's cute.
And disguises.
Ding dong.
Dopes.
No.
And telescopes.
Hoppa, hoppa, hoppa.
What goes on here?
All right, now on to the next disaster.
There never was a man this hilarious. Or this delirious.
I demand an explanation for all of this sick behavior.
Because there never was a man like the man who wasn't there.
Canucksploitation.com's Paul Korup. Korup, thank you, Jason. Frequent collaborator that you work with, Jason, doing some of these commentary tracks.
Most of the commentary tracks I've done have been with Paul.
Because the man who wasn't there made such an impact on you, you just had to talk about it? Is that why?
I pulled him. Sometimes he pulls me in, sometimes I pull him in. Man who wasn't there was my fault.
So outside of your love for 3D, I was doing research for that movie, and I saw that the guy who plays Steve Gutenberg's best friend, Art Hindle, he was Canadian. And then I saw that Cindy, who's played by Lisa Langlois, she's also Canadian. She was in class of 1984. Is this the Venn diagram for you, Jason? A little bit of Canada, a little bit of 3D, and that's in your wheel well?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think the Canadian stuff at this point is really the wheel well. 3D blog, depthsploitation.com, was something I started, I think, in 2013, somewhere around there. And I think I ran with it for about 5-6 years, but I really haven't put much on in the last little while. So still very interested in 3D. But really, the Canadian stuff is what we've been focusing on. Kind of a happy coincidence that we had a little bit of a Canadian connection to the man who wasn't there when we did that commentary.
What was the motivation behind the blog? Was it really just a place to kind of pour your thoughts about the 80s classics, the ones that came before that in the 50s, and then some of the modern day stuff?
I certainly have a certain era for depthsploitation, what I call depthsploitation. And that really is after the golden age of Hollywood. It's not really like 54, but it's more like 60s and into early 90s. That was the focus of the blog. So that's how I sort of define depthsploitation.
Was there a gateway film for you that got you interested in all this? Was it The Mask or was it something else?
There were a couple of things that got the blog rolling. One actually has to do with Tony Anthony, his film Coming At You. Mm-hmm. He had embarked on it was like just that era where the first Avatar had come out and 3D was starting to sort of happen in Hollywood again, and he was restoring Coming At You.
I saw God-fearing people stripped of their young women and struck down by minions of the devil. Evil men, led by two evil brothers.
What did they do with the women?
If you ever want to see that scumbag brother of yours again, you do exactly what I say.
You don't have to be afraid, because I'm going to do everything I can to get you out of here.
And I wanted to get an interview. And he was doing interviews, or at least he was sort of fishing for interviews, but I didn't really have a lot to offer him. At the time, the magazine I was writing for didn't really want to do Coming At You because it was more of a Western, and focus of the magazine was horror. That's why I started the blog, get an interview with Tony Anthony.
When he re-released that, there was like a remastered version that was at like an Alamo Draft House, I believe, something like that. I feel like that was like its coming out party.
Yes, they eventually sort of bought what was done.
Gotcha.
I don't know if they had any control over the home video release, but they were the theatrical touch point.
Didn't they redo like some of the 3D sequences in that when they re-released it?
He was very inspired by Sin City and 300, I think, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So he was planning for the entire film to sort of strip out a lot of the color and just sort of highlight sections. So a lot of that is not a lot of that. Some of that is still in there. I think it was expensive from what I understand. And I think he just wasn't getting the money to do it. He wasn't finding the funding to do this remaster in this particular way. So if you have the Blu-ray release, it sort of shows up a little bit here, and then there's this trailer at the end, and it's used quite a bit in there. And then the bulk of the movie is just sort of as we saw it back in the 80s.
That actually connects dots, because when we saw it, I remember the kind of like a re-release remastered trailer had like those Robert Rodriguez Sin City vibes in the tone, and it didn't make sense. But now, Jason, that you say that, particularly with the end credits that do have that sort of very visual iconography that Frank Miller, that then Robert Rodriguez was so inspired by, it's like, oh, that all makes sense now, 100%.
I have great appreciation for the literally throwing everything at the screen in that Treasure of the Four Crowns as well. I mean, if you're going to commit to the 3D, if you want to call it a gimmick, at least at that point, then they absolutely just went full on. So I was appreciating like that opening scene from Treasure of the Four Crowns, especially in the opening credits for Coming At Ya. It's just like a treasure trove of what can we have come out of the screen? What would you not normally think should come out of the screen, but we'll make that come out of the screen as well.
Yeah. Anything we can get to fit through that window into the audience, we're going to throw at you. That's one of the beauties of Coming At You. Now we're talking about Coming At You, but because Coming At You is really, in a lot of ways, a remake of an earlier film that he had done called Blind Man. Not really a remake, but they took that plot and grafted it on Coming At You, because I think their focus with Coming At You was the 3D, and it wasn't the rest of it was just something to hang the 3D on. In some ways, that's kind of exciting about 3D, because 3D in 2010, when Hollywood sort of went for it again and James Cameron had done The Abyss, everybody was trying to really work with the depth and the art in the 3D, but they were really shying away from that classic in-your-face 3D stuff. That's what people remember, and that's what sort of sticks with you. I've seen a lot of the newer 3D, and couple of years go by and it's hard to really remember anything that the 3D enhanced. Especially the better the story is, the more you really lose yourself in the gimmick, and the gimmick doesn't register anymore, right? Even if you're a cinematography buff or something, the cinematography is something that's going to sort of fade away from your memory if you're so focused and ingrained in the story.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember reading on your blog about talking about like a lot of the modern 3D treats it as like a value-added effect, and causing me to kind of jog my memory of like of all the 3D films that I've seen of like the latest iteration of it, like which had those memorable scenes, and there are like so very few of them. Some of them were very immersive. Like there's the one like in Prometheus, which I don't even remember if that was filmed in 3D or if that was just like retrofitted. But there was like a really wide shot of like the ship kind of coming through the atmosphere that I remember at the time being like that. There's great depth there. It wasn't anything coming out of the screen at you, but I'm like that was really cool. And I remember like the credits for My Bloody Valentine 3D as like you're slowly panning down the mine shaft as being something that looked really cool. But other than that, I was really struggling to recall like a single scene or something as iconic as like, the yo-yo in Friday the 13th Part 3 or the eyeball popping out of Paul Kratka's head, things like that. It's definitely a different, it was a different era back in the 50s, 60s, and 80s.
Yeah, well, and what you're describing are like sort of the establishing moments in those films. So that's when you have a chance to take in the 3D, and then the story starts, and then you're immersed in it.
The House of Wax, the ultimate dimension in terror, comes to the screen in StereoVision 3D. Vincent Price, at his diabolical best, will take you room by terrible room on a journey to the ultimate chamber of horrors. StereoVision 3D will synthesize before your eyes the terrifying reality of it all. In StereoVision 3D, House of Wax.
Whereas, House of Wax. One thing I really love about House of Wax is it was made in the 50s when they would take intermissions when they changed the reels. So the film sort of climaxed up to its midpoint, and then the intermission happened. And when we come back, that's when the paddle ball happened, because it was kind of like hey, remember, this film's in 3D, so let's just remind you again. And I don't know if you can really say that's what makes 3D films good, because obviously you want the storytelling to be good. But if you're going to do something in 3D, the gimmick is kind of...
I think Pete and I have seen a lot where you kind of see 3D treatments where you get the gimmick, and certainly Friday the 13th, absolutely. But I think we've seen a few that we've kind of discovered, and I'm grateful that we have. And I think, Pete, movies like Silent Madness, where we thought we'd watched every 3D slasher movie, let alone every slasher movie from the 80s, and then to discover Silent Madness. And towards the end, when the slasher is hunting the final girl, and there's just a use of depth to create a little bit more fear and anxiety in like this boiler room, while not used necessarily for gimmick there. I think when we saw it, we're like, whoa, this is a great use. And just like when we saw, was it a Star Hunter, Star Chaser, The Legend of Orin, not necessarily gimmicky, but using it in that sense when you're doing a spaceship chase through a bunch of kind of like caverns. Well, just to have that depth of field, I think in some of the ways where like Jaws 3D, you could say had both. All right, when you're in those underwater tunnels, that's how you get the depth of field. You get that cool pirate ship that's in the distance versus a small submarine. All right. But then you get the really bad kind of like iconic shot of the shark coming towards the screen. So try to balance out how do we get folks to remember this for what it is, as a gimmick, as a way to get asses in the seats. And then also the artistry of it, where the filmmaker is like, no, how can I make my thing more interesting?
Yeah. Yeah. And they, for sure. I don't know what more I can add. Like,
maybe what I was going to ask you about that, Jason, is I think maybe that was the genius in someone like Tony Anthony, who from selling Xerox machines to hustling and literally crowdsourcing before crowdsourcing was a thing, leaning on his experience before making these kind of like spaghetti westerns, repurposing that idea, and then he makes Coming At You. But maybe his genius is in knowing that there is a line between using 3D as the gimmick to get movie viewers to be very happy with the experience, but then also like, hey, here's something new, here's something different. My movie may not be better, but here's something that makes it different, and maybe that's enough. But then for him to do that so early, even before Jaws 3D or Amityville or Friday the 13th, it's like, if anything, between him and Earl Owensby, which we'll definitely talk about.
Yeah.
I think I have more of an appreciation for those guys than maybe for Paramount, being like, hey, Frank Mancuso, like, go make something. And he's like, all right, well, I'll make Rosemary's Baby 3D. All right, well, that didn't pan out. All right, well, then I'll make Man Who Wasn't There in 3D. It's like, oh, all right, cool. But you're writing the success and the work of people like Tony Anthony, and then Earl Owensby was like, I'm going to do that, but at a really small scale, in a drive-in, in the South. And it's going to be about Rottweilers because I can't afford sharks.
Yeah, there's something to be said for that. Tony Anthony, his sort of start in 3D came when he was a spaghetti western star. He had pretty big hits with the Stranger series, the first two. And then after that, he was always also a producer. He made quite a few really interesting spaghetti westerns, some that didn't play well at the time. But he was asked to do an East sort of meets West kind of 3D production, because there were these productions being done. There was The Magnificent Bodyguard, Dynasty, Revenge of the Shogun Women, which were being done in the 70s. And that's kind of like he'd gotten asked to be in sort of one that never got made. But I think it was from that same group. That's when he was fascinated. He said no, but he was fascinated with the technology. And that's when he decided to try. There was some groundwork that he already came from to making Coming At You. They'd shot a bunch of Coming At You, and they had problems with the cameras, and he actually went back to find new cameras to try to make this thing happen. It was a big gamble for him, which is typically what he did with his films, and always like looking for money.
From reaching out to try to interview him. So break our hearts, Jason. Why did it not pan out?
Ultimately, because I didn't have anywhere to place it at the time. He was looking for PR for Coming At You. I wanted to talk to him on the phone, and that's what I couldn't get to happen. I actually had sent him a list of questions, and he was slowly answering all those questions. I had 23 pages of material that he had sent. He hadn't got to Coming At You at that point. And then I think the deal was made with Coming At You for the re-release, and he's kind of moving on. So that I didn't hear back from him.
And I feel like there's an opportunity there. So, Mr. Anthony, if you're hearing anyone that knows him, maybe someone that gets him DoorDash, I don't know, just let him know. We'd be more than happy to talk to. Jason would be more than happy to talk to him.
I would. I greatly admire what he's done.
Absolutely. Another name that we've talked about, Earl Owensby, because we have to talk about him. And this is not to give short shrift to all the big movies, again, Jaws or Friday the 13th, but Pete and I discovered Earl this year, and man, I have nothing but admiration for Earl. He told me as much in his documentary.
Oh, that's the myth, the legend. Yeah,
that's right.
It was not narrated, but might as well have been narrated by Earl himself.
That's right. That's right.
His films are really interesting because they are that really like no budget kind of approach, and often he would star in them himself. And he wasn't the greatest actor,
as he readily admits.
But they're entertaining. They're really entertaining.
Yeah, was a great actor, but he was serviceable. And I think at one point, is it Richard Jansen who was in the Fugitive TV series from the 50s?
Yeah.
And I believe he had reached out to his agent, Earl did, and it was something like $500,000 for X many days of shooting when he did Challenge, trying to kind of work off the success of Walking Tall. And I think that's when he kind of did the math and said, why am I going to pay this guy $500,000 to come in to shoot a few days, to obviously take advantage of his celebrity, but I can just do this myself and maybe do something more with the movie stunts, bring in other actors. And there's an awareness in knowing your limits. And I think he knew them, but to his benefit in being able to make films that he's like, I'm going to star in these and maybe that'll save me money, but I'll be able to put this technology into, I think it was 6 total 3D films. And, I think some of his quotes are like, you don't go out to make the movie unless you're going to make money. And he had already done back of the napkin math to figure out how he's going to do it.
Yeah. He built a studio, an empire, a small empire. His films were always designed, certainly at the beginning, to play in a regional drive-in circuit. So their reach wasn't necessarily going to be that wide. He started out pre-VHS. He wasn't expecting that money to come in either. So I think he had to penny pinch because there was only so much money that he could make in that smaller regional drive-in market. Yeah, I don't know. What do you say about Earl? His films are really entertaining, and then he got bit by the 3D bug and he kept going.
83 was Rottweiler. 84 is Hot Air. 84 is Chain Gang. 84 also Hyperspace and Gremloids. Hit the Road Running is 87. Tales of the Third Dimension, 84. Now, Pete and I have seen Chain Gang, Hyperspace, and Gremloids. Tales of the Third Dimension, of course, Rottweiler. There's only the 2, Hot Air and Hit the Road Running. So, Jason, on your end, have you gone through Earl's catalog? You mentioned you had that phase maybe a decade or so.
It was about a decade ago, so my memory of the actual films is a little foggy.
We won't test you on the details.
Okay,
but but it seemed like in our limited research, Hot Air, Hit the Road Running, man, those are impossible to find.
Well, I had reached out to Owensby Studios at one point, and I ended up talking to his son. And oddly enough, like the accent on the phone, that Southern accent, I, as a Canadian, had a real hard time understanding. But from my understanding, is Hot Air was the co-production, and so they didn't retain the rights. So that's one reason they didn't self-release it, because 10 years ago when I did reach out to them, it was specifically to buy some copies on VHS of these films, and that was one they didn't have. And Hit the Road Running is they didn't have that in there, but you've seen that, right?
Yeah, I found it on eBay for a few $100s, and again, no short shrift to Earl Owensby. I just wasn't prepared to part ways with a few $100 for Hit the Ground Running. To be fair, it was shrink wrapped, and the person did put the disclaimer to say, I don't know if these work. I don't know if they've disintegrated inside. Take the risk. I just didn't want to pay $317 plus shipping and eBay fees.
Do you know if it was like a studio release? Because he had on his tapes, he would have the little EO symbol, and it was like,
from what I saw, Jason, it was like I think part of like maybe a 25th anniversary like compilation.
That was the era. Okay, so that was available. Maybe I do have it.
Okay.
Like I said, it is 10 years ago.
It seemed like they had similar branding, so maybe that's a collection. You say maybe that's when you were able to buy those?
It's time to go back to Owensby's catalog.
Southern accent aside, what was the experience like, if you can remember, like dealing with Earl Owensby's son on the phone? Was like
oh, it was great. Yeah, no, it was very, very helpful. Yeah. It was pretty short-lived. I just remember that being like, because I was not expecting to have a problem. So the fact that I did was just kind of stunned me. I don't know what that says about me, but
like Bernie was saying, like we discovered Earl in the past couple of months, which, as two people that I feel like, we've logged a lot of hours watching a lot of movies all across the gamut, from the really horrible to the really, award-winning, impeccable credentialed films. And so it's like blowing our minds that we found someone that had like this little niche market in the South like that we had previously never really heard of. And I'm curious, is there anyone relatable to like that north of the border in Canada? Like, is there a Cecil B. DiMaggio of Nova Scotia or something like that you've been able to discover over the years?
No, not really. There hasn't. Like the homegrown Canadian industry has always struggled with finding venues to screen our stuff. And it really wasn't until the 70s when there was anything about the Canadian film industry, there was the tax credit era. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the films we made were co-productions that companies would come up. It'd have to be a Canadian crew, often a Canadian director, Canadian writers, but they would put in some money and we'd make these films for international markets. Not always, but often.
Jamie Lee Curtis did a bunch. It was like Prom Night and Terror Train. Stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah. And that was all part of that era. And it was because of this tax shelter that people could put money in and they'd get 100% return on what they put in. So as far as the tax write-up goes, it was lucrative. But by the time the 80s rolled around, I guess, the cultural elite, I don't know. They were expecting something more highbrow, I think, being made. You go back and look at some of these films and now there is a cultural element to them that it's really interesting. You can certainly it's a reflection into the time. Mm-hmm. And some of the directors, if these opportunities hadn't been there, they wouldn't have gone on to do what they did.
Sure.
Like somebody like Paul Lynch, who did Prom Night, he started out trying to make more sort of little melodramas. Then, as it usually went, they wanted to make, the directors and producers wanted to make money, so they'd go more into exploitation. And then often they'd return to television, but somebody like Paul Lynch was responsible for a number of episodes of The Next Generation, Star Trek, and had quite the career. And there wouldn't be that training ground. John Huston made a film in Canada, probably his only horror film, called Phobia.
You're lost. Everyone looks strange to you.
They are prisoners of their own nightmares.
That's you. You'll face your phobia head on.
They are tormented by their own fears.
You're running for your life, Laura.
No! Don't touch me!
They are trapped by their own terrors.
Look up. There's no one with the child. She's gonna fall.
And they are about to become the victims of a killer who has discovered the perfect murder weapon. The human mind.
Was it an accident or suicide?
Of course, as far as I'm concerned, the prime suspects are your experimentees.
Be careful. Let's be careful.
4 out of 5 patients in this project are dead. Now the deaths must link up somehow.
Dr. Ross! Stop it!
Peter, what happened?
Dr. Ross, I can't take it! Help me! Dr. Ross, please stop it!
It's considered in the canon of John Huston films. It's kind of the lowest of tiers. So that did happen, yeah.
Have you done a commentary for that one?
We did.
Because I saw there was another one, Dirty Money, which is kind of like a 70s crime thriller that you did the commentary for as well with Paul from Conexploitation. So it seems like you have that kind of attraction to 3D movies, but also exploitation cinema. And then on top of that, movies that happen to be Canadian productions as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Canadian production part with Paul's website, which is conexploitation.com, and he's been doing that since the 90s. There's that natural sort of knowledge behind Canadian films. So a lot of times the commentaries kind of come to us because of the Canadian content. So that's part of the focus. we do it together. So, and that's what he's known for. Often, well, we might know the film, or me more so than him. I might have heard of the film. Paul's probably seen it. But we've never really done the deep dives into them. So getting these films and getting a chance to do these deep dives is a lot of fun. Sometimes we get to interview people related to the film, and that's always interesting.
What's your prep work for something like that? Will you watch it a few times beforehand to kind of get a familiarity with it? Will you ever go in like as like a first time watch and just start riffing?
No.
What's your approach?
We watch it. We watch it usually a few times, especially if it's a film we haven't seen in a long time. Usually I watch whatever I can get my hands on, and then the companies will usually give us a final master, so we get to see what it's going to actually look like. So we've watched it at least twice at that point, sometimes more. We usually get together and talk about it, and we both go off researching and we sort of talk about what we're researching. And then we sit down and we have a monumentous Zoom call that goes on for hours and hours because we don't write a script, but we are still trying to get all the information in. So we do a really long call, and then usually it falls on me to cut it.
Okay. I was going to say, who gets
that's me, because that's my background.
Joy of editing that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if there was some sort of choreography there where, you're kind of playing the movie, like you're saying, like this, like on a Zoom call. And then if you have something to say about a specific scene or a fact that you found, you're like, hey, I have something to say at, the 17-minute, 23-second part. So Paul, like, shut up for a second, because I got to drop a few facts here. And then so it seems like it's you talk for definitely longer than the length of the film. And then later in production.
So we're talking for, hours, but we start the film and we talk about what we've decided we're going to talk about till the conversation peters out. Then we pause the film and go and do it again. And then if there are sections that we specifically want to talk about, things happening on the screen, we just grab it because I'll deal with it later. We like to have things that are very specific scene to scene when we can.
And that's the end of part 1 of our conversation with Jason Pichonsky. Pete and I loved chatting with Jason. The man loves film, the man loves exploitation films, and he loves 3D. And anytime we can talk to a passionate fan about any of the above, we love it. We learn so much and just adds more things in our to-watch queue. So make sure to listen to part 2, because Jason drops a ton of knowledge on 3D films and specifically 3D technology as Pete and I continue our journey of discovery into the world of 3D films, especially those 80s 3D films that we grew up on. Jaws 3D, Friday the 13th 3D. We have a little bit of a blind spot about the technology and how it works, how it was used, how it was misused. And Jason gets to bring a little spotlight to some of that technology and helps us out a bit. Again, just awesome to talk to someone like Jason who knows so much and is kind enough to share it. And thank you for being kind enough to listen to the episode, and make sure to listen to the next Fan2Fan podcast.